Good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy to see that so many of you have survived the morning and the afternoon. I've decided to stay on for this late afternoon session with this panel. My name is Ingrid Winter. I am the Norwegian Special Envoy at the Center here, and I have the great pleasure of captaining through this afternoon panel with our three distinguished speakers. First out is Professor Libicki, who holds the Kaiser Chair of Security Studies at the US Naval Academy. Very nice. In addition to teaching, he carries out research in cyber war and the general impact of information technology on domestic and national security. His prior employment is extensive and includes 12 years at the National Defense University, 3 years on the Navy staff, and 3 years at the US Government Accountability Office. Next to him is Dr. Lonergan. She's an assistant professor at the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. I hear we have some competitive cadets. Very good. She's also a research scholar at Columbia University. No one from Columbia. Okay.
Much better behaved.
She previously held positions as a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Atlantic Council, and she has served as senior director at the U.S. Cyberspace Stellarium Commission. At the far end of the stage for me is Mr. Batrla. He is a researcher at the Institute of Law and Technology at Masaryk University in Brno, and a security consultant in the private sector. And this is me practicing my Czech, so thank you for your patience. In his research, he focuses on threat actors, especially ransomware groups, which is also what he will be talking to us about today. Michael previously worked at the Czech Ministry of Defense, and he has been both a visiting scholar here at NATO CCD COE and at the NATO Stratcom COE in Riga. So we're very excited to have him here. But first out, Martin, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we got that right. Okay, that's who I am. That's where I work. That's what I'm going to be talking about. These are my caveats. Okay, don't have to put them up for very long. And because the conference theme is keep moving, we'll go to slide number 3. Okay, so what motivates this discussion? We have what I would call standard deterrence. And standard deterrence essentially rests on 3 things. 1, you make some indication or declaration of what you don't want the other side to do. Number 2, if the other side does it, you have the responsibility of determining whether it crossed your red lines, who did it. And number 3, if you're going to instantiate a deterrence policy as opposed to just have it, then you have to mete out punishment. Okay? Standard deterrence 101. Does it work? And this is a big question, but I'm going to say it doesn't seem to be working well enough. The best example of coercion in the service of improving cyberspace was the agreement signed by Presidents Xi and Obama in 2015, in which the Chinese agreed not to carry out certain forms of cyber espionage. But the linchpin of that agreement was not wonderful and good feelings between the 2 presidents, but the implicit and not always implicit threat that the United States would put sanctions on Chinese companies that disobeyed. Well, the lifespan of that threat was roughly equivalent to the remaining lifespan of the Obama administration. And a large reason, in my humble opinion, not everybody agrees, for that was because deterrence has an assurance component. It's not only, if you do this, I'm going to do that to you, but it's also, if you don't do this, I'm not going to do that to you. And you had an administration that had a much broader set of complaints against China, at which point Chinese said, damned if we do and damned if we don't, so we might as well go ahead and do. Okay? The other instance I would point out is there was a specific warning from President Biden to President Putin not to go around hacking our infrastructure, and it's too soon to tell whether that in fact reduced the amount of hacking. One of the things we know about deterrence, is we always know we can tell when it fails, but we can never tell when it succeeds. Okay? Part of the problem with standard deterrence as we practice it, where attribution is an important element in the game, is that it puts the burden of proof on defenders. Okay? It forces those who would deter to detect the cyber attack, characterize it as a cyber attack, somehow make the argument that it crossed the red line, although US red lines are not particularly precise, and then do attribution. And then you have the other side basically going, what, us? We are a law-abiding country. You wouldn't even think of doing that. And that's sort of where it lands, okay? But still, the burden of proof is on the defender. Meanwhile, if you were to actually levy a punishment, you can't go around saying, not us. That indictment of your hackers, that wasn't our country. Yeah, okay, it wasn't Pennsylvania. Okay, now there are some people who make the argument that the reason deterrence has been disappointing is because we haven't pressed hard enough. Okay, and if you look at the two forms of punishment that have been used since roughly 2014 and going forward, it's been sanctions and it's been indictments. Indictments could very well be dissuasive were it not for the small fact that when we indict state actors, they almost never see the inside of a US courtroom. As for sanctions are concerned, there is a zero-sum game in sanctions. We cannot, for instance, credibly threaten not to trade with North Korea because we don't trade with them. We can't do that for Iran because we don't trade with them, right? And we're getting to the point with Russia that we can't credibly sanction Russians for cyber attacks because we are credibly sanctioning them for a lot of other misbehavior that we like even worse than their cyber attacks. Okay? And then there's a final point, is that we have found that novelty, the fact that cyber attacks are often a surprise not in how they got in, but why anyone would want to do something else like that at all, are characteristics of a lot of cyber attacks. If you put together a bunch of smart folks in 2015, as I was honored to be among those, me plus a bunch of smart folks, right? And you try to list all the things that were red lines for the United States, nobody would have come up with a hack on the DNC. Okay? If you try to explain yourself why it is that the solar winds attack somehow crossed the red line, you can tie yourself in knots, because cyber espionage is in fact accepted state practice within certain limits. If you look at Colonial Pipeline, right, is a problem that was a ransomware attack, or is a problem that Colonial Pipeline decided to respond to an attack on their business systems by closing their operating pipeline? Okay, so you have issues. So, what I'm going to entertain, is something I call obnoxious deterrence. The word obnoxious is so you can associate me with any particular term here at the conference. Okay, and it works as follows. It starts off with one side carrying out behavior you don't like. Okay? So you carry out cyberspace operations which are seriously annoying, and I'll get to why it has to be seriously annoying, but short of armed conflict for very obvious reasons. Okay? And I've given two examples, but that's because somebody asked me for examples. It's actually harder to give out examples and defend them than it looks like. Okay, so we now start being annoying to the other side because we believe that they are doing things that we find annoying. Okay? The other side, suitably annoyed, starts asking for negotiations, whether they're public and formal, private and informal, tacit, used through signaling, is a different matter. But anyhow, there is some sort of give and take in which ultimately you end up with an agreement, be it formal, be it tacit, because a lot of agreements from the Cold War, for instance, were tacit, they were never written down, in which both sides refrain from the behavior that the other side finds particularly annoying. Okay? And then we come for the last part. What if the other side cheats? Right? What if they go back and engage in behavior that they don't like? Well, the solution is we engage in behavior that they didn't like. Right? Which has a certain, first of all, we don't necessarily have to explain ourselves. And second of all, we don't necessarily have to force them to predict what's coming, because inherent in the nature of that agreement is a notion of what's coming. Okay? Now, at this point, I'd like to thank CyCon for allowing me to introduce the concept, and now I'm going to spend the next 2 slides shooting at it. This to prevent you folks from doing the same. Okay. Sorry, I'm a little behind on the clicker. Okay. Okay, there's obnoxious deterrence. The obnoxious deterrence raises, whoops. Okay, let's go back. Okay, compared to standard deterrence, obnoxious deterrence, okay, I was right the first time. Okay, obnoxious deterrence raises some issues of its own. The first thing is it helps for it to be a cyberspace operation. Now notice that the US approach to other people's cyberspace operations we don't like involves something outside of cyberspace. Why should obnoxious deterrence involve something inside cyberspace? Okay, that depends on the kind of agreement that you want to conclude. If your agreement is, I won't do X if you don't do Y, right? That's an asymmetric agreement if X and Y are not the same. But there is an expectation, in fact, that what you're basically saying is, I won't do X and Y, and you don't do X and Y. It's our X that you find annoying, it's your Y that we find annoying, right? And we put it together in a package. Once you cross domains, your negotiations become a lot more difficult, because the advantage of staying in the cyberspace domains is it gets rid of a lot of extraneous issues. Once you cross domains, you're into these extraneous issues, your negotiations become far more difficult. Okay, so that's the first constraint. Number 2, it needs to work. Now, this is so obvious that I'm going to have to explain why it's not obvious, right? If you do deterrence and you threaten somebody with something you've never done before, they have to believe that what you're going to threaten with is in fact going to work. So for instance, a nuclear deterrence policy. We are threatening people, heaven forfend, with essentially missiles that we haven't used in combat, right? There's a high degree of faith on the other side that they're going to work. With obnoxious deterrence, however, you're starting off with the behavior that's the punishment, which means if you're going to be at all impressive, the thing actually has to function. And in cyberspace, that's not a guarantee, right? It's one thing to say, if you mess with our electric grid, we'll take down yours. It's quite another thing to be able to do so with a high degree of reliance. With obnoxious deterrence, before you even have any deterrence, you've proven yourself capable of doing a certain category of annoying things. Okay. Now, number 3, and this one is particular for cyberspace, and that is, it has to be working as defenses arise. The medium of cyberspace is one in which measure and countermeasure are continually competing against one another. Okay? So you can expect that the other side's first reaction is not going to be to go to a negotiation table, but to use internal measures to cost effectively reduce the annoyance level of your cyber operations. So if you're going to be effective, you need a set of cyber operations that don't countermeasure that easily. Okay, number 4. That's actually is obvious enough I don't have to explain it. It needs to be annoying enough. It needs to be annoying enough that countries start negotiating, or at least raising the issue at the state level. Okay, a lot of things that we see in cyberspace are annoying, but not annoying enough. So there's a certain threshold of annoyance that you have to meet. Okay. Number 5 is you have to get enough out of it, or at least appear sufficiently committed, that your form of obnoxious deterrence is not going to go away on its own, right? You have to be invested in it. You have to credibly convey the notion that you're going to keep going on as long as the other side keeps going on. Okay. Now, then we get to the converse. If the results, if the results of obnoxious deterrence are too attractive, then the other side figures you're not going to give it up, right? For instance, we carry out a lot of cyber espionage, as do other countries. We find the results useful, otherwise we wouldn't do them. In fact, I may even go out on a limb to say that we find the results so useful that we would be very loath to give them up, to the point where the other side probably doesn't believe that they can negotiate us away from doing that sort of stuff. Okay? So there's a model here. If it's painful enough to you, you won't keep at it. If it's beneficial enough to you, you won't give it up. So you have to find the sweet spot in the middle. Okay. You also have to have the technical characteristics, where if you promise to give it up, the other side can detect that you're promising to give it up, right? If the other side does not have any confidence in their ability to monitor your behavior, if you give it up, you don't have the verify part of the trust but verify. Okay? And then finally, you should be able to come out ahead if the other side does likewise. And it should be the sort of operation that doesn't have an obvious escalation path. Now, that doesn't mean escalation won't occur, but it does mean that in escalating, somebody has to do something radically different, and there's an inhibition against that. Okay. Having given you all of these criteria, what have I ended up concluding? That it's a wonderful idea in practice. Okay? But is there any actual form of cyber operation that can meet all these criteria? And I can't guarantee that there is. And you're going to end up pitching a lot of things that might seem superficially attractive, but don't necessarily fit these criteria. Okay. Added issues come from one-on-one bargaining. For instance, the United States has a great number of allies, clearly NATO, in the Pacific, etc. To what extent will U.S. negotiations on behavior in cyberspace reflect the interests of these allies, or to what extent should negotiations proceed through alliance structures? Okay, now in Europe, obvious an alliance structure. In Asia, not so obvious an alliance structure where the United States has a set of bilaterals. So that's a question. Will it necessarily lead to norms building? And this is a question of narrative. Okay, our current narrative is responsible countries don't do irresponsible things in cyberspace. And once we declare an action to be irresponsible, it's incumbent on us not to do it, right? Because if our argument on norms is you're doing something bad, you're really not in a position to actually go ahead and do it. With obnoxious deterrence, you've abandoned that notion. Everything sort of becomes reason of state, almost up to the Melian dialogue level, okay? We don't like what you're doing, we're going to do what you don't like, and then we can come to an agreement. Not that one is right or one is wrong, or there's a standard of responsible behavior. There isn't. It's in many ways morally neutral, and this notion of moral neutrality doesn't really sit well with some people, which includes me about half of the time. Okay. Lastly, because the United States has at least two major adversaries, two minor adversaries in cyberspace, there's a lot of negotiations. Would one side see what the other side has managed to negotiate as a floor or a ceiling? Okay. So where are we? We are, I can sort of end here. I can go to the next slide, which is a set of, okay. Okay, here's a conclusion, right? Tempting idea in theory, practice maybe not so much. And then here's what I say, questions, but I decided to leave out the word. Okay, are we good? Are we good? Thank you.
Thank
Oh,
you.
yes. Thank you.
Passing the totem pole, excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, Martin, for challenging our conceptions of deterrence and in the same breath shooting it down in classical style. Excellent. Before Erica sets off, if you don't mind, I'm going to very quickly abuse my power up here, and all of you, I'm sure, will have lots of questions, and you will be allowed when they're all done. I have one question, because I want to pull this back to the keynote speaker from our Australian colleague this morning. She talked about how negotiations have only gotten harder, that China and Russia are harder to negotiate with. You've talked about how they pay lip service to a rules-based order. Do you think And again, you've shot it down. Well done. But do you think, what do you think about the feasibility of civilian rules-based negotiations given obnoxious deterrence?
Well, if I had a great deal of trust that you could not only craft a norms regime, but keep people to it, I probably would have selected another candidate topic for this forum, okay? The fact of the matter is she's right? Our relations with Russia took a strong downturn after 2014. Our relations with China have faded considerably, notably after 2017 when we started raising a lot of trade issues with China. Okay, they're not, the optimism that we could have felt about norms 10 years ago does not exist today. With Russia, we'd have to go through a lot of changes to get back to there. With China, it's not going to be obvious. It's more possible than with Russia, but I wouldn't give it a 100% guarantee. Okay, now, when you start talking about norms, you end up having to talk about punishment. It's fairly clear that wagging our finger at Russia and China doesn't really work that well. So the question then becomes, what is the form of punishment, and can you do this? In a bilateral negotiation, you have the advantage, and I'm thinking in terms of the various nuclear treaties we had with the Soviet Union or that NATO had with the Warsaw Pact, right? And it's like, if we don't like your if we think you're cheating, we'll just leave. Simple, straightforward, you know what the consequences were, okay? But when you have a norms-based approach, particularly it's a multilateral norms-based approach, it doesn't work, right? Because what are the consequences if you leave the norms? You're going to misbehave? No, because you've already promised you're not going to do bad things, and you've just marked this out as bad. So you don't have that kind of leverage. So you're forced to go cross-domain. Mm-hmm. And when you go cross-domain at a risk of exaggeration, so nobody asked me, are you exaggerating? Yes, I am. At the risk of exaggeration, you either have countermeasures that are weaker than the original effect or stronger than the original effect. And the stronger ones, the weakness ones tend towards irrelevance, and the stronger ones tend toward escalation.
Thank you for a very bleak summary of future of negotiations. Speaking of punishment, Erica, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Oh, okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Erica Lonergan. I'm really excited to be here. I'm presenting a paper that I co-authored with Admiral Mark Montgomery, who could not be here today to present with me, unfortunately, but I'm really excited to share sort of our thoughts and ideas with you. And I'll just caveat this by saying that we sort of see this project as a conversation starter, as the beginning of a conversation. We don't have, so the topic is the promise and perils of Allied offensive cyber operations. We're really focusing on NATO in this paper. And we sort of have some ideas that we're curious to get feedback on, and so really excited to present this here to get your feedback and have some, hopefully, stimulating discussion about this topic. And I have the similar caveat as Professor Libicki. My views are my own, and they don't reflect, as well as my co-author's views are also his own and don't reflect any US government entity or organization that we are or have been affiliated with. So, with that, I thought it would be useful to give you sort of some background in terms of how we started working on this research project about offensive cyber operations in an alliance context, more specifically in a NATO context. And it really came from our work together on the Cyberspace Delirium Commission. Admiral Montgomery was the executive director of the commission. I was a senior director on the commission. And just by way of some very brief background, because I could spend the next 20 minutes just talking about the commission, which I won't, Congress created this bipartisan commission in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act with the idea that the US government needed kind of a comprehensive and independent but sort of multi-governmental take on what, do we have the right strategic approach for cyberspace to deter cyber attacks, and what are the set of policy recommendations, both from an executive branch perspective and a legislative perspective, that would help improve our overall deterrence posture. And I'm just mentioning this because, so we worked on this commission for about a year and a half, came out with this report in March of 2020, right before everything shut down. And the report is, from a strategic perspective, is anchored in this idea of layered cyber deterrence. I don't mean to put out yet another deterrence concept for you all to chew on, but the basic idea of layered cyber deterrence is that we need to take cyber deterrence out of its silo and think about how deterrence might apply differently and look different across sort of the conflict continuum, right? The closer you get to the left side, you're sort of at lower levels of competition, and as you get further to the right, you get toward crisis and conflict. Again, the point of this presentation is not to talk about layered cyber deterrence, but I wanted to highlight a few insights from this work that informed how we sort of started thinking about offensive cyber operations in a NATO context. And there are 3 insights in particular that I think are relevant to give you some context. The first is that, the title of this panel, our group together is I think it's offense the best defense in cyberspace, right? Is that something like that?
Behind you.
Yes, our offensive operations the best defense. And so despite the fact that I'm talking about offensive cyber operations and deterrence this afternoon with you all, I actually don't think that offense is the best defense in cyberspace. And that was a really important insight from the Commission's work and this idea of layered cyber deterrence. Having the credible capability for effective cost imposition to include cyber and non-cyber means is, of course, an important element of deterrence, right? But alone, it is insufficient to address sort of the full scope of the types and the magnitude and the various actors threats that we face in cyberspace. So that's sort of the first caveat. If I had to answer that question, it would be no. The second is that, and this is really where our paper kind of, the jumping off point for our paper, is that when we think about cost imposition, sort of early thinking on cyber deterrence, and in particular early strategy and policy in the United States, as well as in allied and partner governments, has really focused on cost imposition above the threshold of armed conflict, right? And what layered cyber deterrence try to do, and what other approaches have done as well, is kind of extend that left side of the curve below the threshold of armed conflict. With the recognition, like Professor Libicki mentioned just a few minutes ago, that even when you're sort of in a context of competition, for deterrence to be effective, there has to be some type of punishment that's imposed. And then the third insight, which is relevant for the US government, but also highly relevant, even I would say more relevant for an alliance, is that there are inordinate hurdles in terms of interoperability and coordination within the federal government. Not to mention between the federal government and state and local actors, and between the federal government and the private sector. And these kind of coordination and cooperation challenges were something that we really struggled with during the commission, and I think is also something that is really important to take into account when we think about how an alliance should think about sort of an approach for cyber operations. So that's just giving you some context. And then the other sort of more obvious source of this project was really thinking about the threat environment. And there's a typo in there. It should say the primary cyber threat to NATO. I guess I could have made it a guessing game to see who could infer what I'm referring to here. But so, did this work on the Commission on Layered Cyber Deterrence. At the same time, we're seeing the sort of continuing evolution of the threat environment. And I think what's really fascinating to me is that, on the one hand, you have an alliance like NATO that has really matured over time in terms of its thinking and its organization for cyber deterrence and defense. And that focus has really been on sort of the high-end conflict. But what we've seen from an empirical perspective is that much of the threat stems from sort of the range of malicious cyber activity that takes place below that threshold. rather than sort of the high-end decisive cyber attack. And I think what's really interesting, and this is probably a controversial statement, and I'm sure there are many in this audience who will disagree with me, but I'll put it out there to see what you all think. I think that there's been a lot of debate about what are the sort of lessons learned from Ukraine, ongoing lessons being learned for the nature of cyber conflict. And there's a panel, I think, happening tomorrow that will get into these questions far more deeply than I will today. But I think that, the debate has been framed in this very binary way, with one camp saying cyber isn't, is not important, it's not happening in Ukraine, and another camp saying it is, it's just confirmation that, cyber war will take place and is taking place. I think the evidence is a lot more mixed, and I think that at least what's been publicly released so far, whether you look at the Microsoft report or other reports that are coming out, as well as statements from senior government officials, that it's actually far more nuanced and complicated and challenging to coordinate cyber effects with kinetic effects on the battlefield in a way that's decisive. And the level of coordination that we're seeing doesn't seem to be perhaps as high as we might have expected, which is why there have been all these debates that have been prompted about, well, how come, where's all the cyber war in Ukraine? There's a lot of cyber activity, but sort of walking the line from cyber activity to sort of meaningful decisive impact is a lot more complicated and contested. And this confirms research by a lot of great academics, like Nadia Kostyuk and Yuri Zhukov, who've done work on the role of cyber operations in the battlefield in the past. And so I think that this is all pointing us to having a conversation about how an alliance like NATO should think about the cyber threat, not just for the high-end, conflict, but also below the level of armed conflict, right? Because we know that's how NATO adversaries are operating. Okay. So we tried to sort of lay out a bunch of research questions in this paper. And again, these are questions that we have some initial thoughts on answers to. This is sort of the opening salvo, so to speak, of a research agenda. So the first question is, should there be a role for offensive cyber operations in the context of NATO deterrence, sort of below the level of armed conflict, not just integrated with conventional military operations above that threshold? And if so, what are the potential challenges and impediments to doing something like this, which I'll say off the bat are significant, but something that I think is important to start thinking through and having those conversations about, which brings me to my last question, which we kind of put out in the research paper, which is what initial steps could the alliance start to take to improve coordination around offensive cyber? Okay, so I think it's helpful to kind of lay out how the alliance has evolved, both from a sort of organizational and capability perspective and also from a strategy and policy perspective since 2008, because there really has been a lot of evolution and maturity of thought and of organization. But I think there's still some sort of unresolved tensions and mismatches that we're seeing kind of bubble to the surface over the past few years. And so, as I said, how NATO has organized itself for cyber has evolved a lot since Bucharest in 2008. These are all things that you all know, right? There have been a number of organizations stood up within NATO, mostly focused on the defensive aspects of cybersecurity, whether it's incident response and rapid reaction teams, communications, the 2016 Cyber Defense Pledge, where allies pledged to increase their spending and investment in all these types of defensive measures, training and education and information and so on and so forth. And that's all great. There's also been growing but sort of limited organization on offensive cyber, focus on sort of the integrating cyber into conventional military operations. In 2008, NATO stood up the Cyber Operations Center and created this sort of voluntary process for individual nations to provide cyber effects. It reached initial operational capability in 2021, so again, very sort of new, emergent organizational capability. At the same time, there's also been really important evolution in NATO strategic thinking and NATO policy around cyber. around cyber deterrence. And again, I'm sort of reiterating what a lot of people in this room already know, but I think it's helpful to kind of see how the evolution has taken place over time, right? So in 2014, the Alliance agreed that Article 5, the beating heart of the Alliance, the all for one and one for all, applies to cyberspace. And in 2016, NATO recognized cyberspace as an operational domain, similar to air, land, and sea. I think what's really interesting is what happened, the result of the 2021 summit in Brussels, where, of course, the Alliance reaffirmed that Article 5 applies to cyberspace, but the language was sort of different from in the past. In particular, the language of the communiqué stated that the impact of significant malicious cumulative cyber activities might, in some circumstances, be considered as amounting to an armed attack, and therefore could potentially be justification for invoking Article 5, which would obviously happen only on a consensus basis. But I think the language is really interesting because I think it reflects a maturation of thinking about the nature of offensive cyber and the nature of the threat environment, because we haven't seen the sort of singular, decisive cyber attack that has major cataclysmic consequences. Instead, what threat actors have done is sort of conducted cyber campaigns that in their accumulation could in some circumstances rise to significant events. And so, but this gets at this kind of challenge and ambiguity about where exactly the threshold lies for thinking about an appropriate retaliatory response in support of a deterrence objective, because it's not quite as bright and not quite as a red line in practice as perhaps we'd like it to be in theory. And so I think that this evolution in thinking is really important. On the other hand, this sort of lingering ambiguity is, I think, presenting some challenges for how we think about the effectiveness of a cyber deterrence posture for NATO. And those ambiguities are reflected in Secretary General Stoltenberg's press conference and in other public statements that have been made with respect to the Ukraine war in terms of the application of Article 5, with the fear that Russia might perhaps respond against a NATO member in cyberspace as a retaliation for the inordinate economic sanctions regimes NATO members have imposed on Russia, right? So he says that yes, we've stated that cyber attacks can trigger Article 5, but we've never really said, right? We've retained strategic ambiguity about when and how and the conditions under which a particular event might trigger Article 5. And yet when you look at that as a follow-on to the Brussels communiqué, where you have this kind of sort of loosening of what type of incident would constitute an event that would rise to that type of threshold, I think there are a number of unanswered questions. And so hopefully we start to address them, right? And I think that, yes, it's a positive development that there has been all this maturation from an organizational perspective, from a strategy and policy perspective, but there's sort of these unresolved tensions or these kind of mismatches between how, between strategy, policy, and organization and the nature of the threat environment. And I think that starting to have those conversations about how salient and important are these tensions, what are the implications for the credibility of cyber deterrence, how should the Alliance think about addressing them, are sort of what we're trying to get at in this paper. And so the first sort of mismatch or tension that really kind of anchors the whole piece is, on the one hand, the current NATO approach has been focused on how to integrate offensive cyber operations into conventional sort of kinetic campaign plans for armed conflict, which again is a important investment in resources, but it's mismatched to the nature of the threat environment, where what we're seeing, the types of threats that NATO is confronting in cyberspace, have not really risen to that threshold. Instead, they're below that threshold. And so does this tension produce any sort of credibility or problematic issues for its cyber deterrence posture? The second is that, on the one hand, we have, it's politically convenient to draw this bright demarcation between, between the level of armed conflict and above and below that threshold, when in reality, we know that governments can't even agree on what constitutes that threshold. And so the ambiguity is sort of politically convenient, but perhaps not strategically useful. And when you apply that to planning and developing capabilities around cyber operations, it might be sort of nice to try to contain that to things that apply to wartime. But the reality that we all know is that there are things that you have to do in peacetime and in competition to prepare for crisis and conflict. And some of those things involve sort of tricky and potentially problematic operations, right? To conduct intelligence preparation, to gain access to strategic targets, and so on and so forth. And so while it might be nice to kind of segment, okay, we're focused on offensive cyber during wartime, and we don't really want to talk about it, during peacetime and competition, there are things that need to be done for the employment of those capabilities to be actually effective and useful during wartime, right? So again, there are these sort of tensions. The same is true for offense and defense, right? For NATO, again, strategy and policy has been mostly focused on sort of defensive cyber, and mostly organized around defensive cyber. But in sort of while some activities are obviously defensive and some are obviously offensive, there's a whole range of things that are far more ambiguous. And so again, the bright lines are not quite as bright in practice. And then there's the reality that there are NATO members who have already articulated strategic concepts that take into account countering adversary threats below the level of armed conflict. The United States is an obvious example, right? 2008 was a watershed year for US cyber strategy and policy, with the release of the 2018 Department of Defense Cyber Strategy, which articulated this concept of defend forward, which kind of reflected a shift in how, and how the Department of Defense conceived of when and where its capabilities would be employed below the level of armed conflict. The same is true of the United Kingdom, right, which has become even more and more public over time in acknowledging cyber operations, often conducted in tandem or in collaboration with the United States, to impose costs on threat actors, again, like below the level of armed conflict. So I think all of these kind of tensions and ambiguity suggest that a conversation should be started about how we think about offensive cyber below the level of armed conflict. And so, in offering that, I'll start by sort of undermining my own case, I guess, and note that there are a whole host of challenges that sort of immediately bubble up to the surface when we start to think about how to even have this conversation and think about its implementation. At the political level, right, and I'm going to butcher the quote here, but when the conflict in Ukraine first started, President Biden, I think he's repeated this line more than once, but definitely do not quote me on it. But he is, because I'll bungle the exact phrase, but he's emphasized over and over the importance of the unity of the alliance, right, and how that has been critical to the effectiveness of its response to Russian aggression. When it comes to offensive cyber, there isn't a lot of unity. There isn't political consensus around these issues, and that's because there still are these sort of persistent disagreements about basic concepts and definitions, when it comes to sort of variations in how sovereignty is defined and what constitutes a violation of sovereignty in cyberspace, variation in terms of what types of cyber incidents would sort of cross a threshold into armed attack, or even disagreements about the difference between the use of force and armed attack, right? Disagreements about the acceptability of cyber operations to gain access to maneuver through within networks owned by one's allies, right? And so there are a whole host of political challenges that make this a difficult conversation. Even more so, there are a whole host of sort of operational and tactical challenges in terms of thinking about implementation. And I just have highlighted a few up here, and they're only just a few, but I think it illustrates some of the hurdles here. One is sort of the relationship between intelligence collection requirements and military operations, both in terms of the fact that a given state has to make definitions about intelligence gain loss, right, and whether they're willing to compromise access that enables intelligence collection and supports intelligence requirements for the conduct of military cyber operation. Those are only compounded when you think about aggregating those decisions in alliance context, particularly given that NATO rests on consensus. The other reality is that intelligence collection requirements are set at a national governmental level, or from a NATO perspective, decisions about military operations are at an alliance level, right? And so you may have significant tension there. Cyber operations rests on intelligence, and states have been very circumspect for obvious reasons about sharing exquisite intelligence that enables the type of access that's required for conducting meaningful strategic cyber operations. The reality that even allies spy on one another, right? Because with the exception of certain alliances, because espionage is an accepted state practice. And so, that poses some challenges. And then obviously concerns about just, sensitive information that's being shared that may end up in places it's not supposed to. There are also significant variation in capabilities across the alliance. There are also concerns about escalation risk, although I have that as a question mark because in general I'm skeptical that cyber operations create meaningful escalation risks. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if that's of interest. I have no idea how I'm doing on time.
You can have 30 more seconds.
30 more seconds. Okay. So I think that in terms of next steps, I guess this is, as I said, sort of an opening to a conversation. I think it would be really useful to start having those conversations about how an alliance like NATO might start to think about offensive cyber operations, not just for armed conflict, but sort of below that level and what that might look like. I think that interoperability is a bridge too far, but starting to think about improving coordination, whether it's improving intelligence sharing, which is sort of an obvious recommendation, but also, assessing whether particular alliance members may have a comparative advantage in, let's say, access, for instance, because of geographic proximity or capability or what have you. Whether you can sort of divide and conquer a cyber campaign, and particularly for developing access and capabilities against really strategic, difficult targets. But anyway. As I said, initial conversation, looking forward to your thoughts and questions. And I think that was 30 seconds. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Erica, very much for introducing a conversation with a healthy academic attitude of immediately red teaming your own point. Well done, both of you. Again, I'm going to take advantage of being up here. And I have a thought on the ancient tactic of war, death by 1,000 cuts. Well, not so much war as a torture method.
Yeah.
Death by 1,000 cuts. The low sophistication operations that you're constantly seeing against various targets, frankly, all over the world, but very often against Western democracies. Do you think this proverbial cyber war, would it be fair to say that the target at the end of the day is the core foundation of what builds these states, namely this liberal democratic world order? rules-based order.
That is a big, so just so I understand your question correctly, so you're asking whether the sort of death by 1,000 cuts in cyberspace over time will erode what we understand as the foundations of the liberal world order.
Correct.
Okay, no.
Okay, very cool.
I can elaborate.
You may get a chance later. But first,
Okay.
We're going to move over to Michael and hear a bit about the non-state actors that are involved in other operations.
Yeah. Thank you to Erica and Martin for great presentations, and thank you all for being here. So our research topic with my colleague Jakub, who is sitting there, is about non-state actors and specifically ransomware groups, and whether it is possible and feasible for us to try to counter their activities through offensive cyber operations. So before we start, the usual disclaimers that we all like to use, I would like to also mention the second one, and that is that we used only open source and public informations, which is also one of the limits of our research. So before I get to the topic of the offensive operations, let's maybe try to create some shared understanding of where we currently are with the ransomware issue and how we got there. So on one side, you have numbers and volumes and data about how it is, how it is going to, how it over the last 3 years got a bit worse, and on the other side, quite literally, you have the stories and the other considerations behind that. So we've seen events like the Colonial Pipeline attack, the JBS and Kaseya. We have seen attacks on healthcare and education systems during the height of the global pandemic. And we have also seen Conti, one of the major groups, pledging support to Russian government and threatening retaliation to anybody else who would try to attack Russia in the events in Ukraine. And what we haven't seen are the countless attacks on small and medium businesses causing economic damages that we simply do not know about because of underreporting. So how did we actually get there? We have currently something that we call as a ransomware as a service, which is no longer a bunch of hackers hiding in a basement and launching cyber attacks, but rather a thriving business environment with dedicated roles, management people, budgets, rented offices, vacation plans, and even office politics. So we have different people that specialize in doing things they're good at, be that the initial access, the hacking, be that encrypting the networks, handling customers, payments, and infrastructure. And we also highlighted several factors that we think are contributing or are important to that helped create this ecosystem. And that is the network effect, or the availability to share and buy and sell the initial accesses, tools, knowledge to recruit and market their own brands in the ecosystem of underground forum and marketplaces. Obviously, the ransomware business couldn't really be conducted at that scale without cryptocurrencies, which allowed to the transfers of millions of euros or dollars, whatever you prefer, without the traditional oversight of banking industry and governments. And we have also the geopolitical considerations that limit our law enforcement activities, and especially non-cooperative jurisdictions that harbor their cyber criminals in exchange that they don't target their own people. So to tackle these challenges, over the past few years, many experts and indeed public, military and intelligence officials sounded the notion that this is maybe a national security issue that should be handled also with the use of offensive cyber operations, and especially by military and intelligence agencies. So that is the starting point of our paper. To try to approach it from a data-driven way or the empiric way, we try to select and find out as much case studies as we could on the broadest sense of what could be considered as an offensive cyber operation against ransomware group. And the broadest sense is, in our research, basically any unauthorized use of systems and data that these groups are using. And we also try to leverage the information we have on other operations against non-state actors, be that the Operation Glowing Symphony by JTF Ares against ISIS, or the multinational Europol-led disruption of Emotet botnet that also had an offensive cyber component by Netherlands police. So with this approach, there are obviously some challenges and limitations that mainly stem from the lack of data and observability. But I start with the first one, and that is, how do you differ the impact of offensive cyber operations versus other factors, be that political pressure, economic and social developments, or even the traditional law enforcement activities? The second challenge is, how do you actually measure impact in an ecosystem that is rapidly changing and evolving almost every day or every week due to how the groups and the variants rise, disband, rebrand under pressure, and what is essentially partially obscured to us because we don't have the visibility there. And the third one is about how do you account for events and information that is not available in the public sphere. So those are obviously big challenges to our research, and that is also why we don't presume to present results, but we are rather trying to make some initial observations that will hopefully be further developed as our understanding and the data set grows. So for the observations themselves, we try to divide them into two logical groups, and that is impact on the whole ecosystem level and on the individual actor level. However, the division or the classification is really an artificial one, and they often overlap and influence each other. So the first one that we have seen on the ecosystem level is exclusion from the broader cybercrime ecosystem. And that was noticeable, especially after the Colonial Pipeline attacks and subsequent events, that the ransomware operators and variants and affiliates were ostracized by the rest of the underground ecosystem because of the pressure and the visibility that was against them that impacted other people's operation. We have also seen the influence, and this is really hard to discern from the other factors that come into play here regarding targeting, be that from the industry or the geographic consideration. And we have also seen some shifts in the operating models. So in the public operating model, it's really the brand of the malware that gets presented to the affiliates, which are free to use them for a fee. But some groups, especially after the pressure, converted a bit more into the private model, where they carefully select their affiliates, so the people who do the actual hacking, and also their upstream and downstream business partners, and try to vet them and try to keep the operation under wraps, which also limits their profits and scalability. So especially in connection with the first individual level factor, is the shifts in the most popular strains. So the strains that have been compromised or were known to be compromised had a harder time to attract new affiliates, to recruit, to sell their programs, and that led to some shifts in what was the most popular, the hype at the moment. The brands and reputation are really at the core of ransomware stuff, apart from the profits, which I'll talk about in a moment. They impact how they can attract developers, pen testers, and the low-level stuff which we don't often hear about. But it has also some consideration on the victim side, and that is to have the reputation on one hand to be able to follow up on threats, to be able to actually keep the data encrypted, and to be able to, with the technique of double extortion, to have them available to the public, so the confidential data of companies and organizations. So the second potential impact, or the impact we have seen, is obviously on the core of the ransomware business, and that is profit margins and bottom lines. And it's noticeable from, especially from the Conti case. The Conti was one of the largest organizations until very recently, and after their own compromises and also compromises of their close business partners, they often burned down and rebuilt their whole infrastructure. They often dismissed and then rehired a lot of their staff, excluding for a several few that they knew, let's say, in the real world, or had a long relationship with. They were rebuilding identities, changing nicknames and emails and accesses. And they also, which is kind of ironic, had to increase their security spending on solutions that were helping them to monitor their administrators, and also they were buying tools like endpoint detection and response. We can't also discount the psychological effects, which were mostly seen on the Revil case. So in a very simplistic way, what we can say about the case or about the group is that after the compromise of a single server and subsequent actions on objectives that were, as far as we know, focused on identifying members of the group, they scrambled. It's also, it's of course the influence of other factors and other events, but that is the short version. And one thing that is sometimes overlooked in focusing on the most impactful and the leadership and the pen testers or the hackers is that there is a lot of low-level support staff handling operations, be that laundering money, be that administrating servers and botnets and what so, that are usually low-level, poorly paid, and they sometimes resent what they are doing. And by making their lives harder, we can influence their burnout and their motivation to continue to do so. Of course, there are some other intervening factors that both allow us with some options and are considerable challenges for this topic. And that is, as for us, the criminals also have hard time doing a lot of basic stuff like securing their infrastructure and keeping their anonymity over time. And trust on the internet is hard, and it's especially hard with the underground forums and lack of real identities. What is challenging for us is many things in this respect. First of all, balancing legality and proportionality and not over-militarizing the issue. Spillovers and accidents are always a concern for a predominantly civilian infrastructure, and allocation of resources actually means two things here. So that is, of course, balancing the focus on cybercriminals with what other threat actors we have, and there are many. But it's also to be able to define what is important to us and to not get into the trap of a tactical whack-a-mole of trying to do everything or trying to just, suppress everything that is there. So to conclude, from the data and from the cases we have seen this approach of offensive cyber operations against ransomware groups is maybe best perceived as an important tool in the whole of government approach. But providing that we have some basic prerequisites like cooperation inside and outside of the public sector, deep understanding of the environment, and maybe most important of all, reasonable goals and definitions of success of what we want to and what we can achieve in that space. And that is why this is not a silver bullet, but rather the part of the whole tool set. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to receive your questions.
Thank you, Michael, for highlighting the unforgiving nature of this domain where both your proverbial good guys and bad guys face rather similar challenges. I am going to stop abusing my power as moderator, and I won't bug you anymore, but I'm going to try to summarize, because this panel has a question as its title. I think we can say that Erica does not believe that offensive operations are the best defenses. Merton thinks that obnoxious behavior can compel actors to behave. And Michael, maybe. And Michael's observations indicate that disruption is effective, but certainly no silver bullet. So that's a yes, no, and a maybe.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think you all want to take credit for the maybe. Right, so I'll turn the floor over to our wonderful audience. Thank you all for your patience. Before we get started, I will remind you to please introduce yourself, name, affiliation, whatever else you want to share about yourself. But very quickly getting to an actual question. We have about 22 minutes left, and out of respect for your fellow audience members, try to keep it brief. Also, if possible, I prefer it if you can direct your questions at a specific panel member instead of an answer from the entire panel, because then, well, we're not going to get through a lot of questions. We have two very eager ones in the front row, so I think we'll start with you two. And then I promise to look to the far back as well, so you won't be ignored.
All right, thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. My name is Alaydar Amirseed. I'm from Kazakhstan. I represent the private company, so not NATO allied nation. So I have a question to Dr. Libicki and Dr. Lonergan about how does the state-sponsored hacktivism fit into the consideration of obnoxious deterrence, in terms of offensive cyber operation short of war, in the sense that in the last couple of years, and specifically with this situation in Ukraine, what we have seen is that the great increase in hacktivist group being active and hacking governmental servers, government websites with defacements and personal data leaks, which happened to the numerous private companies. So in a way, what I'm trying to say, in case of Dr. Libicki, state-sponsored hacktivism offers this kind of plausible, in my opinion, offers this kind of plausible deniability for the state in order to denying their obnoxious behavior in the cyberspace. And at the same time, state-sponsored hacktivism in certain cases can be considered as an cyber operation short of war. And in this case, who should be responsible for it and what should be done about those type of situations? Thank you. Hopefully I was brief.
Okay,
Thank you.
let me redefine your question, of course, as an academic. The question is, what about non-state actors acting under the color of state, but not obviously under the state, right?
Yes.
How do we prove they're acting as part of the state? And that's part of the attractive feature of obnoxious deterrence. We don't have to prove anything. We just go back to our behavior. Now, if it turns out that we react to their behavior and they didn't do it, their motivation to stay in the deal goes correspondingly down. So we still have to maintain that incentive by being roughly right. And the more correct we are, the more we preserve their incentive to be part of the deal, okay? The problem with standard deterrence is exactly the one you point out. You know, the Russians say, hey, it's a not, sorry, don't want to pick on them, except I do. You know, it's a, we're not responsible for these guys, right? And then we have to start making the case, forget about it. Yeah, we think you're responsible, and this is how we're reacting.
Erica, would you like to add to this?
I think it's a great question. I won't rephrase the question, but I think that, you know, I think when we talk about sort of proxy actors in cyberspace, it's often held up as this thing that challenges deterrence or something that is particularly problematic. And I guess I don't find it as problematic as maybe some others do. And I think that's because, you know, I'll steal a phrase from Jay Healy, and he talks about the spectrum of state responsibility, right? So we can think about different, you know, the extent to which a particular sort of target of a cyber operation believes that a government, rather than sort of a lone wolf, you know, hacker or organization, is responsible for that activity. And it's a spectrum, right? At the end of the day, these are political decisions less than they are sort of technical ones, right? And so that's why I think it's useful to think about responsibility along a spectrum rather than as this binary, you know, did the state sponsor it or did they not sponsor it? I think what's really interesting when you bring up the example of Ukraine is that what I find most fascinating about the cyber dynamics in that context is sort of the decision on the part of the government in Ukraine to sort of throw away plausible deniability, probably because it's not so important during an actual conflict, although Russia still maintains, you know, denies responsibility for cyber attacks in the context of Ukraine, even though we all know that to be ludicrous, right? But you know, Ukraine has taken the opposite approach and sort of very publicly said, okay, we are calling on an IT army, and you know, we are going to give this army directives through a Telegram channel and actually provide a targeting list and say, okay, go, right? That's the most you know, straightforward example of state-directed cyber activity. And then you have all the way at the other end of the spectrum, states like Russia that completely deny these types of things. So I think about it along a spectrum. I don't think it's that problematic. I think decisions about response are ultimately political. But I do think that's why when we think about sort of rapid responses short of war, getting at a reasonable level of rapid attribution is really important for Western democratic states to be able to justify taking a response, and things that improve our ability to rapidly attribute, particularly to share information that others may have about that would enable more rapid attribution, I think is a really important thing. And by attribution, I don't necessarily mean public attribution, right? I think their sort of internal confidence might be sufficient to be able to respond in a rapid way.
I will dive into this and add just to shamelessly plug a recent CCD COE publication for a legal analysis of your question. There was recently a paper published by the Center I could highly recommend. So you get the political expertise here, and legal one is on our website. Please.
Thank you. It's a peak Northern Europe that when you raise your hand, you're labeled a very eager one. Sven Sakov is my name. I'm a Estonian ambassador to Helsinki. Dr. Libicki, a question is to you. If I understood you correctly, you said that in meting out retribution, it's good to keep in the same domain, not do it cross-domain or outside of the same domain. Was that something what you said? Could you unpack it in a way? Because, I mean, it seems to me rather the opposite, because you can have a better declaratory policy saying if you do this, I'll do that in some other domain. Also, you can dial it up or down better, because as you said, in the cyber domain, you cannot be that certain of the intended effect happening on the other side. And so that basically when you have done your retribution is actually, let's say, and it would be also more obnoxious, just not to limit yourself, to do whatever you want. Wouldn't that be a peak obnoxiousness? Thank you.
All right. Let me go to two reasons. First reason is the usefulness of putting your obnoxious behavior in the cyber domain is that when you come to negotiations, it limits the scope of the negotiations, and the more the negotiations are downscoped, the fewer extraneous matters there are to derail it. Okay, then I expressed another opinion, which was that there's a tendency for things weaker than cyber to be ineffective and things stronger than cyber to be highly risky. And you want some sort of risk effectiveness trade-off. But I want to bring up a point which I didn't, and maybe I should have. One of the problems with sanctions, particularly the way the United States has applied them, is that it's not 100% clear why we've introduced the sanctions on particular parties. Okay? In the criminal justice system, when you go in front of the court, it's for a particular crime, and that's what you're sentenced for. Okay, or not sentenced for, depending on the outcome. And when you start wandering off that crime, you've changed the nature of the question. You want the person that you're punishing to understand that they are punished for what they do. You don't want them to get the impression that they are punished for who they are, right? Because if you punish them for what they do, you have a chance of being able to modify their behavior so they don't do what you don't want them to do. But if you're punishing them for who they are, or more specifically, if they start believing that they are punished for who they are, you cannot change their behavior because they're not going to stop being who they are. And a lot of what we've seen in the rhetoric, and this is beyond cyberspace, but it's also within cyberspace, is the United States is doing this to me not because of what I've done, they just don't like me, right? At that point, your deterrence policy is essentially over, because that's the attitude from the other guy. It's one of the paradoxes of deterrence policy. But of course, after 10 seconds of continuous thought, you realize, yeah, that's true, that it depends entirely on what goes on between the ears of your adversary. And if they haven't bought into your line, you don't have deterrence.
Let's see. We're going to go all the way to the back. John, I do believe, has his hand up. Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Go ahead. You go ahead. You already have a mic. I promised to go to the back, and John promised to be annoying, so it's a good combination.
Good afternoon, Liesje Klomp. I'm a Dutch cyber diplomat in Brussels, both at the EU as well as NATO. I have a question to both Erica and Martin, but first a comment, and I hope that you will be there Friday at the EU-NATO Strategic Outlook panel, where I'll be more going in depth on what the EU has done. But I just want to mention that when you use the examples, Erica, about imposing costs, and you mentioned the US and the UK, since 2019 the EU has done a lot as well. I'll go more in detail to that on Friday. But I had a question on the strategic ambiguity when it comes to Article 5. I didn't quite get whether you were advising us to be more precise, or where you are agreeing that there is some sort of deterrent effect of not being precise on what Article 5 would trigger. And I would be interested to hear Martin's perspective on this as well. Thank you.
Yeah,
You go first.
absolutely. So I think that strategic ambiguity is not as effective. I think strategic ambiguity is not as effective in this context as perhaps it is in others, although it's a preferred approach by the United States and by NATO and by others. And I guess my concern is that I'm a bit of a cyber skeptic in general, right? And so I think that my concern is that given that there is ambiguity about the application of Article 5 in cyberspace, and a lack of consensus about the conditions under which a particular incident would potentially rise to a threshold of Article 5, and given that there's been sort of a revision of NATO's statement around how Article 5 applies to cyberspace, which could include sort of the cumulative malicious cyber attacks rather than a single decisive cyber attack, my concern is that it holds at risk the credibility of Article 5 in cyberspace is contested, and that this could have sort of secondary effects on the broader credibility of Article 5, which is where I think it actually matters. And I know we're at a cyber conference, and so I imagine many will disagree with me, but at the end of the day, what I care about and what I think is important from sort of more of a political science, international relations perspective, and less a cybersecurity perspective, is actually deterring an attack, a real attack on NATO, whether it comes conventionally or, God forbid, nuclear weapons, right? Like, that's where it really matters. And I think that there are, certain types of cyber attacks could rise to that threshold, but I think they're very few. And the likelihood that they're going to happen, there probably will be other things that would already, in conjunction with or in tandem with a cyber incident that would make it obvious that we're in sort of a Article 5 situation. And I think the problem is that with this lingering ambiguity, there are all these things we could point to that, well, is this a cumulative malicious cyber incident or not? What does this mean for, for Article 5 in NATO? And I worry about sort of the sort of broader implications for Article 5, which is the beating heart of NATO, which is sort of the most essential, important part of the alliance, and which absolutely must be preserved, right? And so I guess that's where my concern is. And so even though I understand that we like to have strategic ambiguity and respond at a time, place, and manner of our choosing, I think it is helpful to have more clarity about how Article 5 applies to cyberspace, because there is so much cyber activity, right? There is already, a whole host of malicious cyber activity that traditional NATO adversaries conduct against NATO members and to undermine the cohesion of the alliance, right? So that ambiguity is not, I think is not useful in this particular context. But perhaps you disagree.
I think Martin wanted to add something to this.
Okay, you see the bottom bullet here? This is from your briefing?
Yes.
I want to creatively reread it. February 2022, the chief of police said, "We have stated that speeding can trigger a traffic ticket, but we have never gotten to the position where we give the potential adversary the privilege of defining our speed limits."
Yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah. Yeah, that was good.
Well summarized point. Well summarized point.
You should have just answered the question. I took way too long. That was much better.
John, did you still have a question for us?
I promised.
You did.
I threatened, rather. That was a great response, by the way. John Solomon, FSISAC. When you go after a non-state baddie, as Michael was pointing out, trick bots or Conti, the worst thing that can realistically happen is that they go underground, they regroup, and they resurface, and you have to do it all over again. It's part of life. When you go after a state actor offensively, they're not going to retaliate most likely to hardened military C4 infrastructure. They're going to go after something soft and squishy like a hospital infrastructure. So how do you, as a state actor, on the good guys, doing the offensive cyber operations, I assume we're the good guys in here, how do you understand what potential collateral damage for, subject to retaliatory action is, and how do you go about protecting that? And yes, I am obviously saying this as a representative of the private sector here. your small to medium enterprises, your less mature sectors are going to be very, very vulnerable to state-affiliated, state-sponsored, or even state military cyber attacks. How do you work with them? How do you protect them?
Was this directed at a specific panelist, or do you want something?
Anybody who'd like to respond?
Does anyone want to jump on this? Michael, any thoughts?
Go ahead.
So yeah, I thought that this question was not originally for me, but yeah, at least let's try. That's a good question, of course. But I think I don't have really a good response, so maybe if
I'm happy.
one of you, yes.
Happy to offer a thought. Yeah.
Go ahead, Erica.
Okay, not to like plug layered cyber deterrence again, but what I like about that graphic that I showed, illustrating sort of the role, but also the limits of sort of a cost imposition approach. I think that's where better coordination between the government and the private sector is important, right? There are all these debates about, who's responsible for securing what parts of sort of the broad, landscape of cyberspace, right? But, from a U.S. government perspective, right, there are sort of roles and responsibilities that reside within the federal government and roles and responsibilities that reside within the private sector. I think sort of radically reshaping that architecture is not a good idea, but I do think that, this underscores the importance of improved, I don't want to say information sharing because it's, a phrase that we repeat ad nauseum, but like meaningful collaboration between the government and the private sector, particularly the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, which I realize leaves out the small to medium-sized firms most of the time that you referenced. But I think that, we've seen from a US perspective, the federal government do a better job at sort of recognizing that challenge and recognizing that actions taken in and through cyberspace by the military, for instance, are not going to be perceived by the private sector, and yet the private sector could suffer the consequences potentially, or the response, because it's sort of the soft underbelly of the United States. And so doing a better job at sharing indicators and warnings, at improving collaboration, the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS, has tried to sort of stand up these entities, right? Now we have the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that's meant to be kind of a hub of collaboration to be able to sort of pass, in some instances, information that's gathered by entities within the government outside of CISA, like the DoD or the intelligence community, to the private sector to enable them to sort of improve their own defense posture and resilience. And so I think we're getting there, but it is a concern, and that's why it's tired to talk about the multi-stakeholder model and information sharing and collaboration, but it's manifestly important to improve those things. It's hard. It's hard to do within the United States. It's even harder to do when we think about the reality that the private sector is not bounded by a particular national or geographic area. But yeah, I think the point you're raising is exactly right, and I think that's why there has been greater and greater attempts to improve collaboration. I do think the challenge, though, is with the small to medium end size firms, less the sort of the big players who are already kind of participating in these government collaborative programs.
We have time for one last question, and we have an intensely eager one on the front row again, with a very discreet nod.
Thank you. Dr. Bloomberg from CERTLV. I'm going to be practically annoying with the question. So I'm going to paraphrase the question of the session is, not if the offensive operation is best defense, but do we actually have the capability to conduct the offensive operations as a union or as an alliance? Now, we already know that we have like cyber defensive initiatives such as from the European Union, we have the NATO Rapid Response Team, we have the United States Defend and Hunt Forward. But actually, how do we harness this? How do we harness this capability? And is this actually, when someone calls for help, how do we call for help? And will the nations who participate actually be able to contribute to active cyber defense, not even talking about the offensive operations. Or they will say, in case of crisis, we're going to hold on to these capabilities. I'm talking about the current situation when any of the allies can reach out to someone else and request this capability. And this is the question to all of the panel. I know this is not direct to anyone particular. Thank you.
Well, we don't really have any representatives from the Alliance here today, but if any one of you academics from the US or academic researcher feels compelled to answer this question, you're welcome to just share your thoughts without clearly binding any countries to anything.
Yeah, let me just take a gander at this. And I'll start with nuclear policy, because why not, right?
Small topic.
In 1962, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, tried to interest the Soviets in separating counterforce, which is to go after their nuclear weapons, from counter-value. In other words, basically, if the war starts, we're going to go after your missiles, we're not going to go after your cities. This way you don't go after our cities because you realize what's going to happen, and we can settle the nuclear war with a lot fewer people being dead. Two problems. One, the Soviets didn't buy it, but the other problem was that the French philosophy of nuclear weapons, they did not have enough nuclear weapons to do counterforce. They could only do counter-value. So it turns out that even though in conventional capability, NATO acted as one, in terms of nuclear capability, they all had separate policies and establishments. Okay? Same problem in cyber, right? We talk as if we're all for one and one for all, and we all collaborate, but you're talking, as my colleague here observed, about that part of the defense establishment that is most secret from other folks, right? And one of the ironies is that the alliance that is strongest with the United States in cyberspace is not NATO, it's the Five Eyes. Yeah. And two of those members are not in NATO, okay? So you have a problem in one part of the party going off, doing operations that the other members of NATO are not aware of, may not have approved of, may raise escalation issues that they're sort of being taken along for a ride for and being understandably upset. And it works the other way. If you're trying to modulate your offensive cyber war activities in order to present a sort of consistent position for the purposes of escalation control, and somebody from the alliance decides to carry out a cyber attack that seems to go beyond that, can you count on the other side saying, oh yeah, this isn't the big country, this is just one of the small countries that did it? Or will they have a tendency to say, I can't tell the difference between them, and frankly, if I could, it doesn't matter because they're all one alliance. I'm going to respond to the worst cyber attack as having set the level of escalation of the conflict. Which is a question I don't know how to answer, which is a good way to...
That is an excellent way to end. A little bit grim and a little bit unclear. At this point, I worry slightly about keeping you guys all from the joys of Tallinn. We're also glad you could make the trip. But first, please join me in thanking our panelists.